Welcome to Trinity Online for the 1st of October 2023. Our story, our narrative lectionary rolls along. We've had Abraham, we've had Isaac and Jacob and Esau. Right after Jacob, of course, is Joseph. And then with Joseph, we have a time when the people went down into Egypt. They went down there to be saved because of the incredible famine that was happening up in their own land. So Egypt at that point was a very positive thing, and Joseph actually becomes part of the whole power system within Egypt. But things shift. We'll talk a little bit about that later. And the Egyptians themselves come back into power. There was a different group that had taken over. The Egyptians come back into power, and they now see the Israelites as a real threat. And to a large degree, they probably were. Exodus 1. Now a new king arose in Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we are. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they may increase, and in the event of a war, they would join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built supply cities, Pithom and Ramesses, for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread them even more. The Egyptians became ruthless in imposing tasks on them, and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in every kind of field labor. They were ruthless in all the tasks that they imposed on them. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of them who was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, "When you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them in the birth stool, if it is a boy, then kill it. If it is a girl, then she shall live." But the midwives feared God, and they did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this, and you allowed the boys to live?" The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife can even come in." So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and became even stronger. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all of his people, "Every boy that is born of the Hebrews you shall throw into the river Nile, but you shall let every girl live." Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine baby, she hid him for 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket and plastered it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds on the bank of the river, and his sister stood at a distance to see what would happen. The current carried the baby down to an area where the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe, and while her attendants walked beside the river, she saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid to bring it. When she opened it, she saw the child. He was crying, and she took pity on him. "This must be one of the Hebrews' children," she said. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child?" Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Yes." So the child went and called her mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse it for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed it. When the child grew up, she brought him back to Pharaoh's daughter, and she took him as her son. And she called him Moses, which in Hebrew means to draw up, because he was drawn from the river. But also in Egyptian, Moses means son. So a story that we know very, very well, and it's a story that is so good, so worth recalling. Things were good while they were under Joseph. It was a good time where they were in power. Everybody was being prosperous. There was a lot to eat. But time passed, and the group of people that had taken over, a Phoenician group from the area of Turkey that had come down and invaded the northern part of Egypt, a group called the Hyksos, those people who had been in power for almost 200 years then fell again, and the power shifted back to the Egyptians. All of the people who under the Hyksos had come in, who had immigrated in and settled into that northern area of Egypt, now the Egyptians looked upon them and said, this is real trouble. These people are not like us. They are of a whole different racial group. The Egyptians were a different racial group than the Hebrews and the Hyksos, who were both of a Semitic group. These people are sympathetic to the people that had taken us over, who had conquered us. And so, we really need to do some things to both control them and maybe even to just kind of put them down if need be, because our very existence as Egyptians could depend on what we do with this population threat in the north. They were a threat to the Egyptian political system. They were a threat to the Egyptian culture. So the first thing they did was to enslave them. People who had been free were now enslaved, and slavery for the Egyptians really meant doing all of the labor, all of the hard jobs that the Egyptians themselves did not want to do. And it talks about that they made them work on the building projects, that they built cities and store cities, and that they made them do the really hard field labor. Interesting parallel. But God, in looking on what the Egyptians were doing, God said, the world is not supposed to be this way. I created it where everyone would be respected, everyone would be valued, that this is not a pie. You can respect someone without giving up respect for yourself. You don't have to put other people down and oppress them to make yourself feel better. And so he looked upon the Hebrew people, and he recognized a people after his own heart, a people who were being oppressed. And then God begins the process of freeing them. It's interesting that if you look at the broad history of God's dealing with Egypt, Egypt is not always the bad guy. It's because of what they did that God turned on them and became angry with them. Later, there are places where God has incredible pity on the Egyptians. And even later, during Jesus' time, Jesus himself goes down to Egypt so that he can be brought back after having learned, probably at the Library of Alexandria, this just incredible place of wisdom and knowledge. God does not always feel that way just about a certain people. God is reacting to actions, to behavior. The world isn't supposed to look like this, says God. I created a world where everyone would be equal, but not necessarily equal in this kind of gloppy way that we look at it, but equal in the sense that everyone is treated the same way. Everyone has the same value. That this world and respect and love, and it's not a pie, okay? If you give up, accept. Yeah, because if we have been piling it up at the expense of other people, attitude is one thing, but if we have been piling it up at the expense of other people, if we cannot comprehend the fact that we are living a lifestyle that we are living the same way that the Egyptians did on the backs of other people, then that's the place where God calls us to task and says, like he does to the Egyptians, let the people go. Interesting parallels, and it's always kind of a twist. It's kind of hard to realize that, we always want to be kind of God's buddies, God's friends. And it doesn't mean that God doesn't love us, but there are times when our own behavior and our own actions, our own choices, put us in opposition to the way God would see things. Think of what happened. Even for the Israelites, God keeps reminding them, even when they are freed, remember that you were slaves in Egypt. Over and over again. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. Remember what that feels like so that you don't do it yourself, so that you don't turn the table. But it's only a few hundred years once the people enter into the promised land, once things become a little bit better, all of a sudden they start doing the very same thing that the Egyptians had done. They were told not to enslave people. They were given whole systems. The whole Sabbath system was set up so that things would equalize and that they would not have this whole class of people who were really wealthy and the rest of the people just barely making it or even not making it all. And we think about where we are. One of the things to realize too is that in this whole question of bondage, if you really think about it, in a sense, think about the places where we have sold our own freedom. It's tough and it's risky to kind of be that honest, but maybe sold the security of bondage. How many times do we make decisions because it's in our self-interest? It's better for us, that it's better to choose to kind of turn a blind eye rather than heeding and following a God-given call for justice, which all the way through the Old Testament translates best as simply fairness, but fairness for everyone, that everyone should have the ability to survive. We think to ourselves, well, I would vote that way. I would speak out, but it might put my retirement, my 401k at risk. I would speak out, but no one would believe me and people would think ill of me and maybe I would lose friends. Think of the things that I could lose if I was willing to take that huge risk of trying to live in the world the way God asked us to not think of ourselves first, to care for the poor and hungry, and not just to care for them, but to try to balance it out again. I think it was Desmond Tutu that said that whenever he feeds the poor, people call him a saint, but when he asks why they're hungry, then they call him a communist. To really ask why they're poor. Think about all of the issues happening right now with the United Auto Workers and their recognition of, their wages have gone up 6%, whereas the businesses that they work for are raking in the money, and the executives, the top of the tier, are making millions, close to billions on what's happening with that. And they're saying it's not fair to care for the poor, to care for the hungry, to care for the lost and the outcast, the broken, to care for the lowest on the totem pole, to live a life that is free of idols that we have, if we're honest with ourselves, sold ourselves to. God keeps telling us, you can do it. I know you can do it, but we don't want to. Oftentimes, we just don't want to let go, to follow a different path, and sometimes maybe to actually head into the wilderness, to let go of our own agendas, to let go of our own plans, and to listen to the whispers of God, where God says, I am with my people, all people. It was the Egyptians, then it was the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Greeks, the Romans. The grinding tread just keeps rolling on, where we get out of balance with a God-given vision of a world that could work, that could be fair, that could be run by love and not fear. Amen. Amen.
I'm going on a journey, and I'm starting